that's possible. I'm sure it is. And I'll wait till that happens before we proceed. There we go. So one step at a time, we're going to figure this out. Welcome, everyone, to the Policy Roundtable. We've been hosting these for the last couple of months, and we've had a fantastic set of feedback from people that have tuned in. This is the first time we're doing this live, so we're really grateful to folks that have joined us via Facebook or YouTube. You'll also be able to watch this recording of this after we're done today. The topic today is the economic impact of COVID-19. It's a very current topic. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about this. We've tried to assemble a panel that will speak knowingly and intelligently and with a great deal of sensitivity, because it's a very difficult time. Talking about COVID has become extremely problematic from a political standpoint, but at the end of the day, this is a slow-moving human tragedy where people are actually dying as well, and we need to be sensitive to the micro implications of the macro conversations that we have. Part of the way in which this is coming to you live is that we've got the support of the Canadian High Commission here in Islamabad, so we're very grateful to them for enabling us to try to do this live with a wider audience. And one of the benefits of doing it live will be that we can take questions and commentary as we go. Want to quickly introduce the panel and then jump right into the discussion. We're very grateful to Dr. Aisha Ghaus Pasha. She's the former finance minister for the province of the Punjab and a renowned economist and researcher, and for many years has followed the economy and how it works really closely. Grateful that she's able to join. Grateful that Maheen Rahman, who's the CEO of Al Falah Investments, has joined us today. She's a Forbes 40 under 40. Aamir Ibrahim, who is the CEO of Jazz, and of course Jazz if you've spent any time in Pakistan at all, because you're either using a Jazz SIM or you have called someone today who is using a Jazz SIM. So thank you for the connectivity, Aamir, and for your leadership in issues and areas far beyond just telecom and your own company. And I think we'll see a reflection of that in the conversation today. Dr. Samreen Malik is an economist. She teaches at the New York University in Abu Dhabi. She has a PhD from Cornell, and her areas of interest are diverse. And her last couple of papers are really interesting. Maybe she can talk a little bit about tax avoidance at some point during the economic impact of COVID-19 conversation. But welcome to Dr. Samreen Malik as well. And certainly not least, but last in this list is my dear friend Ammar Rashid, who's a senior researcher and analyst at the Heartfile organization, which conducts public policy relevant research, particularly on public health, but on a wide range of other issues. And Ammar has just published a paper in which he's responded to some of the analytical frames for assessing the economic impact of COVID-19. I thought we'd start with you, Ammar, and maybe you can walk us through what your experience has been over the years, but specifically in the last couple of months, in terms of your relationships with communities, your observations about what the actual micro level economic impact of COVID-19 has been, and where we go from here, where it seems like we're fast headed towards a peak that might be higher and faster than maybe it needed to be.
Hi, thank you, Musharraf, for the very kind introduction and for having me on here. So I'll speak to the things that you asked me on, both my experience with communities and the paper that I've currently written. In terms of the crisis, it has obviously hit working class communities very hard. From my experience, the crisis started from even before any suppression measures were hit, because the global crisis also started dampening consumer confidence and generally the market even prior to the lockdown. So what we've seen is a drying up of incomes. We've seen people struggle in terms of rations. We've been working ourselves on a food distribution campaign in the Twin Cities. And of course, this is particularly hit very hard those who work in the informal sector. A lot of people, particularly domestic workers, have lost their jobs. Even in recent weeks, with restrictions having lifted, most of those jobs show no signs of coming back. Food insecurity remains, I think, the biggest and most pressing concern. But again, I think what's worth bearing in mind is that the crisis is the pandemic, and we should, and it's a global crisis, and so I think a lot of the recent economic discussions seem to sort of miss out on this crucial sort of point and seem to sort of see the public health measures in response to the pandemic as constituting the economic crisis. Whereas I think obviously they have their own impact, but I think there's a crisis that goes above and beyond that. I think one thing that we haven't really gone into yet in terms of our economic policy discussions is really what the long-term impact of the disease spread is going to be. And I think those are significant sort of oversights. So I just want to briefly share, I won't share the whole paper right now, but just some of the key pointers from my recent response to what was the paper published by Yale researchers. And I think it follows a similar reasoning to development economic.
Sorry, just to clarify, is this the Mushfiq Mubarak paper that you're referring to? Because I know that got a lot of play here. It was picked up by the government as well and referred to by the planning minister, certainly, and the prime minister. And I know that Khurram Hassan of Dawn, I think, wrote extensively about this. That's the same paper you're talking about?
Yes, that's it. That's the one I'm talking about. That's the key paper. Like you said, it was cited by Asad Omar as well in his right in early May, before the government decided to remove lockdown restrictions. And there was a similar text published by the International Growth Center by a series of respected development economists. And I mean, they covered a lot of areas, and a lot of the recommendations made a lot of sense. But I think one of the key thrusts of their paper, and I think this has been the emphasis of those papers, has been that social distancing does not really apply in developing country context as it does in developed context. I don't know if you can see my screen. Is it visible to? Is the slide visible right now to the audience? Hello, I can't hear you.
No, I can't see your screen, Ammar. I mean, I can see you.
All right.
Thank you, but not your slide.
All right. I was trying to share my screen, but it's fine. So basically, the main argument that these papers make is that developing country contexts will have lower mortality because of younger populations, and that the economic benefits of saving lives in these countries is somewhat lower as a proportion of GDP compared to developed countries. And for this purpose, the Yale paper as well as the IGC paper suggests that social distancing guidelines should not be enforced in the same way. My key concern here is that this represents something of a misunderstanding of some basic public health public health research and public health measures, and sort of a misunderstanding of what the purpose of those measures is. I think what this points towards is that there's an urgent need for economic policy and development policy in the time of COVID to pay closer attention to public health, and to pay closer attention to the public health models and what they're trying to say. So just to give you a very brief example, the Yale paper basically sort of suggests at the onset that the goal of flattening the curve through strict social distancing, and this is a quote, is to buy time until a vaccine can be developed. This is the same view of multiple officials in the Pakistani government as well. And they all can say that this is far too costly for developing countries to enact, that you cannot wait an indefinite time to impose these measures. And this essentially is a misunderstanding of like the epidemiological purpose of social distancing. The purpose is not to basically buy time until a vaccine can be developed, but it's basically a non-pharmaceutical intervention that reduces the spread of and the mortality from infectious disease. These suppression measures are not supposed to last till a vaccine is developed, but the basic goal of these measures is to reduce the reproduction number, or the R0, which is basically the average number of individuals that one infected individual infects. That is essentially the primary goal of social distancing. So in any basic social distancing model, if a proportion of the population reduces their contacts by a proportion, say a proportion F of the population, reduces their interpersonal contacts by any proportion, that sort of reduces the effective R. And if you can reduce that R to below 1 for a sufficiently long period, then the number of new cases begin to decrease, and the pandemic is contained. So, I mean, the key things to understand about this is that bringing down the reproduction number of the disease, of the virus, which is essentially what contains the disease, does not really even require every single person in the population to practice social distancing. Even reductions by a minority of the population have statistically significant effects in delaying the growth and the spread of the disease and achieving containment. Another key thing to remember is that social distancing does not just have to do with an economic interaction. There's this constant argument made that the poor can't afford to socially distance. In actuality, they can. Even if they continue to work, they can still practice social distancing in terms of community contact, which is a very significant part of our everyday interactions and which is mostly non-economic.
So if you don't mind me jumping in, I think, you know, we had a conversation with Rashid Langrial and Maroof and a whole bunch of other folks that actually specifically looked at this notion of quote unquote a smart lockdown. Now, I think these terms have become so loaded that it becomes problematic to use them. But essentially what I hear you saying is that we don't need to make the choice between lives and livelihoods. It's a false choice. I wonder if I could ask you to focus on what the impact of not making a smart set of decisions around communications around COVID and managing the crisis, what that costs in terms of the economy, either at the micro level or at the macro level.
Right. So, I mean, I think I finally figured out how to share the screen. 1 second. Right, can you see the screen now?
No, unfortunately. Oh, yes, we can't. I think something is coming. There it is. Now you'll just have to do the full screen so we can, instead of seeing, we can see the whole thing. Go ahead.
Just doing that. Right. So I think one, So there's like obviously enormous consequences, and I don't think, like I said at the start, I think what most policymakers are currently looking at is largely the effects, the short-term effects of these public health measures, and what we're not really looking at is, sorry.
Ammar, while we figured it, yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Can you see now?
Yeah.
So what we're not really looking at is the costs of like the contagion, the long-term effects of the contagion. And I think one key thing that a very respected statistician, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, has been pointing out since the start of this pandemic is that you have to look at the non-linearity of pandemics. And he talks a lot about fat tail distributions. And I mean, there's no time to get into the detail of that, but essentially what he's trying to point out is that pandemics have potential for very large, significant outlying events that have to do with like their multiplicative dynamics and the existence of what we now come to know as sort of super spreading impacts. So what essentially this can end up doing in the long term is this starts knocking off or basically preventing from working large parts of the workforce, and it can do this in sort of clustered ways. So basically that. And this can really disrupt supply chains in very like sort of exponential sorts of ways. And because there's like such a large number of uncertain parameters in a pandemic, because of its sort of exponential and multivariate nature, you cannot really do these sorts of linear cost benefit analysis that just look at, okay, how much, what's the economic cost of the deaths? And then, okay, but what are the economic benefits of opening the economy right now? You have to look at a multiplicity of variables. And just like for a brief example, like this is what fat tail mortality looks like. That unlike linear mortalities, like for instance, we saw Asad Umar compare the pandemic to traffic accidents and say that, there's so many thousands in a year and we don't consider those. Well, those have a thin-tailed mortality distribution, which is that you can generally predict how it's going to be throughout over the years. Whereas for pandemics, you can have very large extreme outlier events, which can be completely out of your control. So you have to sort of plan for those.
Yeah.
And so just briefly,
I want to come back to you because I also want to include and involve the rest of the group. I wanted to take this to Dr. Aisha Ghaus Pasha, if that's okay, madam. One of the sort of key takeaways from what Ammar is saying, to put it in simpler words, and we've seen, I think Dr. Tahir Andrabi at Slums has been talking about this, is that when you prevent kids from going to school, and this is just one example, for any sustained period of time, the knock-on effects on cognitive capacity, on learning outcomes, are not just for a month or 2 months or 6 months. They impact children's cognitive ability for years to come. I think that's really the point, is that when we think about either the number of deaths or the number of ICU spots or the number of tests, those are very here and now. And similarly on the economic impact, and I think we'll go into this as we go through the conversation. Today there's a news item that says 2.5 trillion rupees of loss, but it's not really just that loss, is it? We need to unmute Dr. Pasha. Right. Dr. Pasha, you're on mute. You'll need to unmute yourself. There's a button at the bottom of your screen that says mute. Usko aapne unmute karna hai.
Can you hear me now?
Perfect. Now
Okay.
Loud and clear.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, first of all, for this opportunity. It's a very important subject. And as you said that, yes, the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy as well as on Pakistan has been, debated and discussed very intensely now. But the important part is that is the policy guided with it? The way things have been evolving on the economic front as well as on the education front, which you've highlighted just now, one wonders if they have really gone through all that deliberations that we are talking about. A lot of work has gone into it. Researchers have made their contribution. Think tanks have made their contribution. But one keeps wondering if it reaches the right policy level and decisions on the policy are guided by them or not. This is an example. The education is an example. And being an economist, my inclination is to come to the economic side of it as well very quickly. The design of the research program, the relief and incentive program that has been brought in by the government is an example where we feel that perhaps there is this disconnect when the policymakers are not really so into what has been indicated by researchers and policy analysts globally as well as locally, given our current context. Now, on the side of social sector development, the point has been made. It's a valid point. But the problem is that on the social development side, where are we at this point of time? Can our systems take the choking that will result? That is what the government is thinking about, particularly the provincial governments, because provinces have principally the responsibility of providing healthcare, secondary and tertiary healthcare. Do they have that kind of a capacity? And that's why the decision of Sindh and so on and so forth have been driven by this. And they are saying the more interaction you have, and the more problem we're going to get into. People are not really complying with some of the messages that are being related to them in terms of what to do and what not to do, and the things that cannot be done at all to minimize the impact and the spread of the disease. So given that circumstances, it's a very difficult policy option that the government has. And the literacy rate the low level of literacy rate isn't helping the country at all at this point of time as well. And we have started seeing this. So my own thing on this is that lockdown is, I'm afraid, if you want to save jobs, has to take place. And if you have to save lives, you have to take place. If you, on the other hand, you want to consider some of the other elements like its impact on livelihoods and its impact on, as you have said, the educational level and the cognitive levels of the people of Pakistan, then other options have to be considered. At this point of time, the government seems to be not so clear. It seems to be diverting between one post from the other. First, there was initial lockdown. Now there's no lockdown. Now they're talking about other smart lockdowns and so on and so forth. So I think one thing that needs to be done very immediately is also to have a very clear analysis and policy statement of what needs to be done. And I think that is missing. And it is creating confusion among a lot of, the people themselves. And it's confusing even the federating units. We don't know what's happening there. The provinces who are principally responsible for education, health, and so on and so forth. We see variation in their strategies and maybe turnarounds in their strategies as well, which is not very helpful.
Dr.
So,
Pasha, is there an element of maybe us having expectations within Pakistan that might not be realistic? I just wonder, we're seeing now the Swedish epidemiologist who was a global superstar at the start of this, he's come out and he's said that perhaps the Sweden model wasn't the ideal model. And maybe we made some mistakes. I guess my question is, there is confusion. It's very clear. And I think for a lot of us, it's very frustrating because I think we want clear leadership right now. But is it possible that the lack of clear leadership isn't necessarily a weakness of the leadership, but rather the nature of the crisis?
Actually, see, the crisis is unprecedented, at least in the recent history. It is something which the global community hasn't really dealt with in recent years. So that element, of course, is there. And given the severity of its impact, that element definitely is there. But this is a time when governance is and good leadership has to come through. I'm afraid, when will they, if not in these times? And I think they need to this is a gap which I'm afraid I am feeling both on the economic side as well as on the social side. On the economic side, if we can turn to it, that if very quickly, or would you want me to wait for a second round to turn on that? I can see so much confusion on the economic side as well. Would you rather if I continue?
I think maybe Dr. Pasha, if we could go to Maheen, I wanted to take this question to Maheen, and we'll come back around on your other observation. But thank you for that. I think it's a good entry point. Maheen, do you think we're being too hard on the government? Do you think that Pakistan's done as well as it possibly could have? And especially right now, there's a lot of concern. I mean, I frankly share that concern. I was speaking to Ammar. That's kind of how I asked him or convinced him to join us for this conversation. And there's real concern that we're looking at a spike now that was entirely avoidable, not in terms of eventually getting there, but in terms of how quickly it's happening. Do you think we're being a little bit unfair?
I think let's look at it from the perspective of what Ammar just said and also what Dr. Aisha just said. And Ammar pointed out very clearly that lockdowns are long-term fairly unsustainable. We were in a lockdown for approximately 6 weeks before things began to open up. And over that time period, what a lot of governments that we've seen do internationally is they've used that lockdown to either control the spread or then use that lockdown to build their healthcare capacity so that when they do open up, you do have an availability of doctors, beds, and vents, etc., to deal with the COVID crisis. Again, it is very unprecedented, but at the same time, we do have models internationally in terms of how this can work and how it has worked in countries that have controlled it. Either either through lockdowns or then through social distancing, which is what we've talked about. So I think the jury is out in terms of how you want to do this, but I do believe that now that lockdowns are fully open, the government has very clearly picked the economy over health. And I think what they're trying to do is restrict this to being a health crisis as opposed to being a health and economic crisis. So if we look at the economics of where we are sitting now, and I lift from the number that you quoted earlier, which was 2.5 trillion rupees of loss. Now, these numbers are always very difficult to understand in terms of what, how they will, impact things going forward. But if we look at the size of the Pakistan economy, it's about $315 billion. And if you look at 2.5 trillion rupees, that's approximately 5% of that GDP. So that estimate, say we've lost or knocked off about 5% of GDP in the last 3 to 4 months of this crisis, which in no uncertain terms is quite significant. When we look at the policy action that the government has taken, I would say that a fair amount came through the social safety side during the lockdown, which related to the SAS program, the BISP, etc. All those distributions did, I think, help families significantly in getting through this. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of charity work that gets done in Pakistan. So I think we did deal with that food issue and ration issue fairly well. When we look at the economic side, the state bank, I think, took the lead in terms of developing policies to relieve businesses that were closed. So when we look at what the state bank did, there were a fair amount of concessions given in terms of payments of loans that were owed to banks. There was a big pushback in terms of the banking community that we cannot have such massive defaults all at once, and these should be tailored out to next year to allow businesses to come back online. At the same time, no layoffs policy specifically was followed by a lot of organizations, especially here in Sindh, where payroll financing was available via state bank instruction to various banks so that, workers' salaries do not get restricted during this time. In addition to that, there was a lot of lifting of various other controls, etc. In the medium term, that did help with generally cash flow, which is what businesses were facing. So I would say in that interim sort of 6 week, 2 month period, we did see a lot of work being done to help businesses survive this period. Now going forward, you can ask, well, is this going to extend into a longer term economic situation? And I lift from one of Ammar's slides that say, well, what happens when your workforces start getting sicker, which is what we're going to see over the next 3 to 4 months. And there I tell you, that is probably something which you will see much more impact, because for small businesses, particularly SME, you don't have unlimited staff. You're not a large bank or a multinational where you can just replace people quickly. If people get sick, they're out of commission for at least 2 weeks. That has a bigger business impact, in my view, than at least controlling the way you open up the economy. So I think that's something the government now needs to think about. And these words such as smart lockdown really do tend to get thrown around. But the reality is, at this point, we are on an unfettered path in terms of the virus spread. And while the numbers may look small globally, they will add up to having sick employees and then having loss of productivity within the next 3 or 4 months. If I talk about the broad macros very quickly, I don't believe that we have too much of a problem on the inflation side or the interest rate side or the currency side, because our current account deficit is quite controlled, and it will continue to be controlled over the next year or so. The problems that we will face will really be on the fiscal deficit side, because the government is now going to have to generate tax revenue in an economy which will not grow by more than 1 to 2% next year, which will be a challenge. And at the same time, we'll have to continue to provide relief services across the country. And so we expect that the budget deficit is going to balloon well beyond the 10-11% number. So that for me is now the challenge on the government side, and how they tackle that and what policy frameworks come through and how they manage this upcoming budget, which necessarily has to be expansionary. It necessarily has to provide relief, and it necessarily has to provide tax relief, which automatically become stimulus to the economy. So I think it's a very fine balancing act at this point in time. And we will have to see on a month-by-month basis really how this plays out in the future.
Fantastic, Maheen. That was a really good sort of big picture view of the economy. Dr. Malik, I wanted to bring the conversation to you and ask you, one of the things that I've heard from government officials is the importance of how important it was for the government to offer a relief vis-a-vis the electricity bills. And I've heard not just from government officials, but also from small and medium-sized business owners, those that have received that support. How long do you think Pakistan's economy can continue to roll over the impact from that perspective? And would you suggest that the wider impact will eventually make these sort of mitigating measures relatively meaningless?
So thank you, Musharraf. I think I want to make a few points before I get to your actual questions. The first being, which I think Ammar has already spoken about briefly, it is very challenging to estimate the impact of COVID-19 in an economic sense. And the reason is that it is a new episode. We don't have enough data. We can't estimate models. And so everything that we are talking about is more projections or what we think is going to happen. Now, those things are guided by theoretical models that we are aware of. And I want to also caution on that because I've worked on some of that aspect of the theoretical models, that the models are really written for normal times. They're not written especially for these rare times where the shocks are of a magnitude that we have not experienced before. So I just want to add this caution before we just take a textbook policy and implement it in an economy. I don't think that would work. I think contextualizing, taking into account the population that is most affected, most vulnerable is really important in the context of Pakistan, at least. Pakistan is also suffering from another issue which started before COVID-19. It had very low productivity. The growth rate was low. The exchange rate was not even favorable for promoting trade. So we started off at a point which was already a devastating state of the economy, and then we got hit with COVID-19. And now, when we talk about COVID-19, we need to understand a little bit about what type of shock we are talking about. This shock is not any shock that we've experienced in the past. One, because it has both a health crisis, which turns into economic crisis, because health and economy, they don't go separately. They go hand in hand, so one needs to talk about both simultaneously. The second part is that when COVID-19 hits, what happens is that it reduces the supply of the economy, but it also reduces the demand of the economy. So now we have two negative shocks at the same time. So this is very, very different. Then another difference that we could see from the past experiences is the shock has impacted also the service sector, along with the manufacturing sector. In the past, we only had manufacturing sector getting affected indirectly. For example, China starts producing massive amount of manufacturing products at a cheaper rate. We get affected because we can't actually compete with it. But we're talking about a different shock. Here we have a shock which is on a service sector as well, and it is devastating for our hospitality, for our tourism, for our airline industries. So again, the shock is really, really different than what we have experienced. So I don't think that taking any kind of past experiences or any textbook examples and implementing it in the economy is a wise way forward. when it comes to an economy that was already suffering, the issue is that there are a lot of inequalities across the population. So there is a set of population that's becoming richer, and they're just the fortunate ones. Then there is a set of population that's becoming poorer, and they're below the poverty line. But we always forget there are the segment of the population that is hand to mouth. They are very vulnerable because they are very easy to be pushed to the wrong side of the income distribution when these shocks hit. And it's not about COVID-19. Any small shock hits, it can actually move them back in the wrong direction of the income distribution, where they're going to make choices. As Dr. Pasha has been pointing out that they're going to make choices about whether a child should go to school or not. So education is also an investment that people make decisions about on a daily basis, especially the ones who are vulnerable. I think that the help from the government, which is more targeted to the population, that's making really important decisions, which will have long-term effects, is particularly important at this point. So, of course, there's an over-the-board kind of, you can give cash transfers or cash payments to everyone in the population, but there we need to be very, very cautious, because when the government gives or injects money into the economy, it is stimulating demand, while the supply is not changing, either because of health crisis or lockdown or whatever the scenario is. Even if the lockdown goes away, the recovery is going to be slower. So the supply is not going to go up at the same rate as we've seen in the past.
I think, Dr. Malik, that's a great sort of entry point. I think the part of our conversation, I want it to be focused, and I want everyone to have a chance to speak on the recovery. But before we enter that phase of the conversation, I wanted to bring Aamir Ibrahim in, who's quite patiently sort of waited. And I had asked Aamir to be patient, because what I wanted you to do, Aamir, is maybe bring all of this together from the vantage point of a market-making company, a company that essentially defines at least one major industry, but then that industry itself being definitive in so many different ways. So, Dr. Malik, we'll come back on the question of recovery, but I wanted Aamir to maybe set the stage for that conversation by talking about how Aamir Ibrahim and his team at Jazz have seen the COVID-19 crisis from start till now, and where you are now, both in terms of the company itself, but also all of your partners, your vendors, your consumers and customers. It's a pretty big community. Give us an idea of how big it really is and what the impact has been. Aamir?
Thank you, and I'm glad and grateful that you did not ask me to comment further on the COVID crisis and my take on it, because I'm not an expert. And what we do see is there are a whole bunch of new experts. No disrespect to anybody over here, but whether lockdown is a good thing or whether we should go for the Sweden approach and herd mentality, I think a lot has been said and debated over there. Quite honestly, I tend to agree with a few comments which have already been made that this is unprecedented, while I think there is actually no country which has been consistent and calculated in its response. Most of the countries has reacted, including Pakistan. So I think initially we were a little bit happy with our reaction, and now as we head closer to the peak, we are getting a lot more nervous. Now let's contextualize and see whether there are any opportunities in what is otherwise considered a gloomy environment. And I think that's where we need to perhaps steer our energies towards, because it is easy to get overwhelmed with all the negativity. There are hardly any silver linings that we see as of right now. So from an industry which has perhaps been declared an essential service in this crisis, we keep on talking about social distancing, and let me just highlight one thing. It's actually physical distancing that we need, because we are a lot more socially connected than we have ever been in our lives. And this is the first pandemic which has actually happened in the age of social media. But let's not debate that any further on whether we chose the right word or not. What we did need was physical distancing. And in those times, reliance on telecommunications, internet became more and more important. And I think to a fairly significant extent, the various operators in Pakistan did step up to their responsibility, and a lot of good work has been done in terms of keeping people connected, which gives them mental reassurance to speak to their loved ones, but also access to critical information. So in that sense, I think Pakistan has done pretty much as good a job as anywhere else in the world. We had some structural issues in terms of our lack of 4G or broadband, and that cannot be fixed in the short term. Now, what we do see, we don't know how long this work from home or any derivative of this work from home will last, but we do need to build our digital infrastructure. And when we start talking about opportunities, those are the ones that I see that Pakistan needed in the past. And I think this particular crisis has highlighted the need for policymakers to accelerate the buildup of the capacity of digital infrastructure. And what do I mean by that? That means greater reliance on digital finance. Only 20% of the adults actually have banking instruments. What it means is that we only have about 75 million people, or just about 10 million households, which have a broadband connection. And I'm not going to get into whether educate from home will be possible, is it a healthy thing or not. But the fact is that at least in the interim and the foreseeable future, we need to have tools to at least be able to address some of these things. Now, there may not be perpetual solutions, but certainly in the near to short term, we have to build capacity. So some really important governmental interventions in accelerating our digital capability is, I think, becoming more and more obvious to everybody. What do we do with it? I mean, we shouldn't, as we say, never let a good crisis go to waste. This particular crisis, from our perspective, working in technology, has really highlighted the need for us to take us out of what I literally call Stone Age to where we should be if we want to compare ourselves with the rest of the world. So, I've gone a little bit round and round. We are, as a company, as an industry, looking at how we can facilitate. There are uses of technology where you can trace, track, and quarantine. We are working with, the Command and Control Center, where we do provide a lot of information on who has been tested positive. So while we are not perfect, we have rudimentary infrastructure and AI capabilities in Pakistan. We have been working with the government and the various people who are in the helm of these activities right now to help them mitigate this thing. So that's all from my side. If you have a pointed question, then I'm happy to take that.
Well, I do actually, Aamir, I always have pointed questions, especially for you. I wanted to pick up on something that I know Dr. Malik didn't mean in that way, but she said something about caution when it comes to the Asas program and the handing over of cash. Now, I don't think she meant it she meant it in a kind of macroeconomic way. Basically, you can give people 12,000 rupees or 20 or 30 or whatever amount you want to give them. She was talking about sort of the delta between demand and supply. But you and I have had conversations, and I've had these conversations with Telenor and with Zong as well. So it's not special treatment in any way. There was, I thought, a big window of opportunity through the Asas Emergency Cash Program, in which the government could have chosen to, in very short order, suddenly digitize a massive percentage or fraction of our economy at the kind of lower end of the income level and household income scale. To what extent do you think that opportunity was taken advantage of, and is it too late now, or are we still in a place where the digitalization of the economy is a possibility? And clearly, you will think it's a good thing. I'll go to others, and maybe they can comment on that as well. But in the economic impact of COVID, a lot of speakers, including yourself, have talked about opportunity. Talk a little bit about the digitalization or the digital financial transactions aspect of that opportunity.
Okay, sure. So I think we certainly missed an opportunity, but I'm an optimist. We shouldn't really lose heart and come back and try to convince. Maybe the shortcoming was on our part that we couldn't really convince Asas and the governmental machinery of the importance of this opportunity. We had some fundamental issues. Nothing, how and how much do we give? That's a governmental thing. But the people that we wanted to give to We could have used our databases and our analytics to really identify whether they're actually poor or not. Now, we sit on perhaps more data as a company than Nadra. To not be able to use that thing is actually a wasted opportunity, right? So we know exactly who the person is, what kind of a handset they use, whether they actually fall within the 12,000 range or not. If somebody has an iPhone, why are we giving them 12,000 rupees? So these kind of things, I think some of those factors were incorporated, but the ultimate thing was the distribution and bringing a number of people together at a time when we're trying to encourage physical and social distancing was the exact opposite of what we needed. We gave people money by endangering their lives. And that to me was quite honestly unforgivable. And it's not that we did not have opportunities or products that could have been readily used. But like I said, that was a missed opportunity. We haven't lost hope. We're still working with SAS, and we're still working on providing rations through Jazz Cash. And we're working with companies like Angro and Daud Hercules and others who basically now want to give food rations in a 4,000 rupee bucket. And that bucket will go directly to somebody's Jazz Cash account, and they can go to a close by Karyana store and take the goods from there, rather than actually having the thing. The crisis today is unprecedented also from the way that we can perhaps manage it. Whether it is an earthquake or a fire or many of these things, people generally come together to help. This is one of those crises where you're actually scared to come together to help. So we have to find ways where we can be further apart, because that ensures our safety. And in that aspect, all elements of digital become so much more important. And I think initially there was awareness and a push around it. But now what I see is that the new normal is looking painfully like the old normal. And yes, we toyed around with lockdowns, and we came up with concepts like smart lockdown. And I had two issues with smart lockdown. A, it wasn't smart, and B, it wasn't really a lockdown. So if you go around, and I was in Lahore over Eid, I hardly felt any different from what I normally did. And let me just give you one statistic. 63% of the population, because we do a lot of research, 63% of the population of Pakistan today think that the fear of COVID is greatly exaggerated. I'd leave it at that.
Well, this goes back to, and it's really hard to contain these conversations. Aamir, you started with this notion, and I think it's quite rightly, we all, I think, are genuinely interested. And so we have strong views on various aspects of it. But, it's clear that there's at least, again, this is just the opinion of one person, but there was a communications gap. Dr. Pasha, I wanted to come and bring this question to you. But not the question of the communications gap. I think, as Aamir said earlier, we've had a lot of conversation about the lockdown, about the wisdom of, the easing of containment and suppression measures, and the failure of communication and clarity on the part of government. I think one aspect of what Aamir was just talking about, and I think is quite relevant in terms of what you'd earlier, I'd like you to connect the two. So you had the SAS emergency cash program that has both micro and macroeconomic potentialities or implications. But it also is closely related, I suspect, to some of the economic impact that you wanted to talk about a little bit earlier. So I give the floor to you. I'll ask you to unmute yourself once again, because we can mute you at this end, but we can't unmute you. It's the ultimate police state. There you go.
Yeah, that's better. Okay, now the economic impact of Corona, actually, let me dwell on it for a little bit, because see, if I want to share with you some of the numbers which I find of a lot of concern, and I don't know why we're not reacting in the required manner. We've already, the two panelists have actually highlighted its impact on growth and everything, how much of a decline in growth we're going to experience. And yes, the IMF has made its projections, the World Bank has made its projection, independent economists have made their projections. In the last quarter, the decline in the economy was of the magnitude of almost 14%, which basically means that this year the growth rate is actually going to be negative. Next year's projection is of growth rate, which actually is less than 1%. Now, why is this growth rate so important? This growth rate is important because if you don't have economic growth rate, economic activity, the level of employment will decline. We'll have higher employment rates, which will lead to poverty. This is the reason why we are just so concerned about this. Now, a growth rate, negative growth rate means that the manufacturing sector is not taking up, and so the exports are not taking place. The agricultural sector, because of the locust and other factors, are not taking place. So our decline in the level of economic activity is very broad-based, and we do not have any cushions, if I can use that expression, that this sector will provide the cushion to the economy in these bad times, so to say, if I can classify them as bad times. So it's kind of, worrying. And the level of poverty increase, if I can quote some of the numbers, Pyle has given some very high numbers, I'm not going to quote them. We can have as many as 100 million people in Pakistan living below poverty line. 100 million people. This is a very large number. And any social protection program, be it SR's program that you have, cannot cater to these numbers. We don't have the resources to cater to these numbers. So we have to come up with very innovative packages, first to give relief to immediately, so that we don't have a lot of hunger and malnutrition increasing and people starving on the street. That income has to be given in the short run. Then we have to come up with policies in the medium term, 3 to 4 months framework, which will give them some kind of a livelihood assurance, these people. And the kind of package that has been announced by the government, I have some concerns about it. I know some concerns have been voiced, and some positives have also been voiced by the panelists. My concerns are as follows. The SR's program, as I said, 3,000 rupees is not enough for a month. What we have an average family size of 6 people in Pakistan. What is 3,000 rupees going to do for that 6-member household? That is a very big question mark. One. Second, well, it is a very good. Let me give credit to the government. Yes, it is a step in the right direction, but we need to do a quicker job of dispersing. And there are questions, if you look at the regional spread of who has got the SR's program disbursements more than the others, there are regional biases. We see 90% of those requiring SR's program, for their benefit in KPK have got it, but the proportion in Sindh and Balochistan perhaps is very low. So these are issues that continue, and we need to correct them. But more importantly is the following. The SME sector, the informal sector, 72% of Pakistan's sector is informal. What is happening to people there? The lack of employment. I'm not concerned about the large scale sector, the corporate formal sector. Yes, they are looking after their people. And the state bank, someone mentioned the state bank schemes, they're largely catering to that segment of the economy. But is that really the larger part of the Pakistan's economy? I'm afraid not. The larger part of the Pakistan's economy is the informal economy. And for them, the relief package, I'm afraid, is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. Let me give you some examples to quote to substantiate what I'm saying. Let me tell you about the state bank scheme, the refinancing scheme of wages. I was looking this morning because I knew we had this, we needed to talk about it today. How much has been disbursed till 29th of May? This, according to this, to the state bank, with the reference to the refinance scheme for wages. The disbursements and deferred payment and the restructuring of loans and so on and so forth. Let me tell you, the amount deferred and the restructuring of loan up till now is 500 billion, which the State Bank is rightly pointing out and is taking some credit for it. But do we know that at this point of time, the outstanding loan for Pakistan is 6,666 billion? So that means the refinancing and restructuring has been done for just 5% to 8%. So the question that arises in my mind is that, is this small? Is COVID has this kind of a small impact that only the 5 to 8% of the firms are requiring restructuring? That is one question that comes to your mind. Is the impact so low that no one is really interested in this and such a small proportion is availing it? Or second, more concerning is that, are the commercial banks not doing a good job of it? They're not interested in really doing it forward. And the State Bank, being the regulator, is just sitting back, and the commercial banks have a lead in it, and they're not really really pushing it at that stage.
Dr. Pasha, on this, if you would allow me, Dr. Pasha, on this, I wonder if we could take this question to Maheen, because certainly for me, this is a discussion that I've been having with a number of banker friends. It seems to be, we just had a float or an issuance of a 200 billion rupee Sukuk instrument, if I'm not mistaken, late last week. I think it was either Wednesday or Thursday. Given the likely scenario vis-a-vis shortfalls in fiscal targets, shortfalls in revenue, whatever the budget actually says on June 12th, we know for a fact that government borrowing is going to skyrocket, especially domestic borrowing. Do you agree with that assessment, Dr. Pasha, first of all?
Yes. And before you move on, one more number I want to share with you about this refinancing of various. The SMEs are not availing it. Can I give you a statistic that following the launching of this scheme, it was launched sometime in May. We've got a good 3 to 4 weeks have already lapsed. And what has happened is that in the last month, we actually see a 22 billion decline in the credit uptake. So which refinancing, what SMEs are availing this refinancing scheme? The numbers given by the State Bank today is that 864,000 employees have benefited from it. Again, out of a total employment, non-agricultural employment of 40 million or so, how much is it? It's peanut. It's not really for the SME sector. It's for those big elite firms who are so easy, who can get credit so easily, that these schemes are meant for. My point is that they're not effectively making a difference in the lives of the people who really need it. The SME sectors, the casual workers, the daily wage workers, they're not really effectively benefiting from these schemes.
Dr. Pasha, you we had not planned this, but you really are tapping right into a serious concern. I think where you and I might slightly disagree is how much of this is the fault of this government. I think these are much more institutionalized challenges. I don't think this is a PTI or but no. I'm keen to hear your reaction.
Can I elaborate on this? It's the design of the schemes. See, you need to understand who you want to target.
Okay.
Through what mechanism? Monetary policy, given that only 6% of SMEs avail credit in this country, you cannot be using credit to benefit them. It's simple designing of the program. Like anyone else, the government surely knows that only 6% of the total credit goes to SME sector. So if you want to benefit SMEs, credit of the type that we have, given the institutions that you have, given the way we are doing businesses at the commercial banking level, is not your solution. Either the commercial banks have to be told in a very firm way with some penalties attached to it that please change the way you're doing business. Go and do some hard work and tap the SME sector. Sitting back and earning profits on government bonds and sitting back and giving 95% of your credit to only 5% of the largest borrowers will not function anymore. You need to change the way
I
you're
could not.
operating.
Absolutely, Dr. Pasha. Unfortunately, I try not to be publicly in agreement with the members of the PMLN for various reasons, but
No, I'm not
but I couldn't.
PMLN here. I'm an economist speaking to you at this point. Please.
Of course, I understand. Maheen, you and I have had this conversation offline for many years, you being a banker and me being a hater. But the Pakistani finance sector at large and bankers at large in this country, I think, I made at least certainly a career choice mistake, because the easiest money that anybody in this country makes are Pakistani bankers. All they have to do is wait for the government to screw up and then essentially watch the government come to those banks and borrow money. And against that borrowing are massive profits. My question to you is this going to be the greatest ever year for Pakistani bankers? It feels like it is, that fiscal 2021 is going to be the greatest year ever for Pakistani bankers, because the amount of borrowing that we're going to see is going to break all records. Tell me I'm being too harsh or too unfair with our banks, Maheen.
I think there's a lot of comments on that. So let me just start with the basics on this one. First of all, if you want to increase employment, if you want businesses to run, if you want the SME sector to do well, if you want the social sector to be lifted up, if you want healthcare to be better, then what you have to do is you have to run the economy to allow that to happen. I think Dr. Aisha in her statement said very early on that we will have an economic contraction in the third quarter. The whole world has had an economic contraction in the third quarter because the whole world was closed for April and May. So we cannot make that assessment based on one quarter. Hence the reason that we are opening up the lockdown now and we are trying to restart the economy. This is what any government would do in this position. I come next to the point which is related to the undocumented sector, which is related to the credit offtake that there is in the country. And, I will address the banking issue last. But I think let's be very clear, the undocumentation of the economy is the result of a multitude of sins of multiple governments. It's not something that any one government can, I think, fix in the span of 1, 2, or even 3 years. It will take decades to resolve the issue of undocumentation. The second point, which relates to credit, Pakistan historically has a very low credit to GDP ratio, very low, leverage ratio. And when we compare that to other developing economies, we are, I would say, at the really bottom end of the spectrum. So it is not an understatement to say that the bulk of our economy, I would say almost 60 to 70% of transactions that happen in our economy, and I'm talking transactions, are cash-based. They are not actually through the banking system, nor are they through any formal financial system. So, governments have tried in the past tackle this through amnesty schemes. This is not the first government to launch an amnesty scheme, and it will not be the last. They have a limited impact. They don't have a.
Since you're talking about this right now, since you're talking about this right now, just plug in into that analysis, if you will, the digital opportunity that we were talking about earlier. Would you agree with Aamir that was an opportunity lost?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we come back to the point on how to, and I'll get to digital and the banking sector in a minute, but what we have to realize that you're dealing with an informal sector that works on cash. So the only way to start that informal sector again is to restart the economy, which has already been done and completed. Now, when you talk about the banking sector and how many people that does impact, or whether or not loans are taken by just the very large and not the very small, I think SME credit offtake has always been weak. It's been weak for the last 10 years or so. And the kind of people that have come to take loan relief, I think the kind of checks and balances that they are within the system, that relief has really gone to the right people. I would say in terms of at least managing the overall salary framework and also looking at the refinance side. The reason credit offtake is low is simply because people are not willing to take loans at this point in time. When we talk about banks and when we talk about the way the banking sector is structured, I do agree here that there is an endemic issue that when interest rates are high, then banks tend to make money off government bonds and not lend it to the private sector. But this again is a problem of fiscal deficits. It's a problem of tax collection. It's a problem of export collection, which is why the government has to borrow more. So these are broad issues that we have within the economy, which will be exacerbated by the COVID situation. Now, when I come to opportunities in here, I think let's talk very clearly in terms of what sectors, because I see a question up on the screen that's talking about what sectors will benefit in this situation. I think the ones that have been allowed to operate over the last 6-7 weeks or so, the ones that have been involved in making sure the supply chains are relatively intact. So if I look at those, I would say, for example, the construction sector, the housing sector, the pharmaceutical sector, the food segment, the logistics segment, all of these have been quite instrumental in keeping essential services together. I think one thing that could have been done, and this was a conversation I had with you about 2 months ago on your previous discussion, is that the digital payments network in the country, when we talk about what the state bank is trying to do in terms of the micropayments gateway, the SaaS distributions I mentioned at that time should really have been done through mobile accounts, through online wallets, through mobile wallets, because that would have completely eliminated the need for face-to-face interaction when picking up these checks. The one thing I would say on digital is I think overnight Pakistani businesses have realized how important it is. In the past, it was very much a nice-to-have situation. It is now a must-have situation.
Has that been your personal experience as the CEO
yes.
of your company?
Yes, so we have seen our online transactions, we have seen our online registrations go up by almost 100 and 150% just in the last 4 weeks alone. And that's really without even pushing through too heavily on the marketing side. So I think the realization of the Pakistani consumer, the Pakistani borrower, the Pakistani lender is certainly coming around to the fact that they don't necessarily want to go into a bank branch unless absolutely necessary. Branchless banking is due to become the norm. Using mobile wallets and online digital payments, that is going to become the norm. And on that front, I see huge potential for us as a economy, where today I think we have maybe $1 billion of IT export to now really scale this up. The problem here is that we don't even recognize the IT space as an IT industry per se, or we simply call it a whole host of other names, but it hasn't even been given the status of an industry as yet. So as a starting point, I think we need to recognize the value this can bring. And one very other interesting factor that is coming out is a number of international firms, international venture capital firm or private equity firms are now looking at the situation in Pakistan from a digital perspective, whether it is telehealth, whether it is telemarketing, whether it is online schooling, whether it is payments, looking at this for opportunities to invest, simply because I think this is the key starting point that we can say that this is the starting point at which we really begin to lift the sector up much higher. So, I mean, I think that there is always opportunities in situations like this, and I would agree with Aamir on that one. The reality is, unfortunately, that we do need a cohesive plan at the federal government level, at the provincial government level, that will allow these things to flourish. Unfortunately, what we have seen in the past and as well during the COVID crisis is there's a complete disconnect between what is happening at the provincial level and what is being communicated from the federal level. And that just leads to persistent things, just falling through the gaps. Now, what you don't want in this situation is that the opportunities that they are to not really blossom simply because of this constant political back and forth. And I think that's something that really needs to be worked on at the provincial government level as well as the federal government level.
So I think, government coherence and planning in terms of the recovery. I want to move the conversation quickly towards recovery. I mean, you've already addressed, I think, one of the questions we had from Sam Smith on who posted this on YouTube, which sectors of the economy are likely to recover the fastest and which are the slowest. Ammar, I'm going to bring this to you, but I just want to go through 2 or 3 other questions, and I'll let you answer any of those that you think. But I have a specific question for you, Ammar, and then I'm going to come to you, Samreen, to expand on your own perceptions of how the recovery might go. But in terms of other questions that have come out, there's a question around exports and whether post-COVID-19 the balance of trade can be improved. Umar Nadeem, our colleague at Tabadlab, has asked about what the new normal looks like and how fluid it'll be with regards to the recovery. So a lot of questions around recovery, which is great because that means that people that are listening or watching are thinking about the future rather than being stuck on what happened, because so much has already been said and written about that. Our dear friend Bela Reza Jamil has asked about fickle policy shifts being a huge challenge for the public and whether public policy positions that need to be firmly directed are there or not. Is there this is the question of leadership that, I'm sure other speakers will address at some level. Ammar, when we start talking about the recovery and we start talking about specific aspects, and I want to connect this to what Dr. Aisha Ghaus Pasha said earlier about the kind of natural advantage that some big companies and big sectors have in terms of the uptake on some of the state bank schemes. Look, in any society, the elite will always have an advantage. But it seems like during a crisis, when the recovery conversation goes the way it seems to be going right now, the non-elite will be at an even greater disadvantage. Is that something that concerns you and worries you? And what would your recommendation be for how to make the recovery, the economic recovery, one that privileges those that need that privilege rather than the ones that have already enjoyed that privilege throughout this period? Ammar?
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack, Michelle. I'll try and approach it I think there's two specific parts to this. I think one has to do with the second part of your question. I think one thing we need to do in terms of the recovery going forward, and I think what this crisis has also opened a lot of people's eyes to, is the complete absence of the lack of social safety nets in this country, which is part of the reason why we're now being unable to even protect lives from a deadly pandemic in ways in which countries, even of a similar sort of income levels to ours, are managing to. So I think what we need to invest in on an immediate basis is a social safety net infrastructure, a robust one that addresses people's basic needs for the bottom 100 million that Dr. Aisha Ghaus Pasha also spoke about. So this needs to involve an expansion of the this program. This needs to involve the establishment of a food distribution system, which is something that we sorely lack even when compared to other economies in South Asia. For instance, one of the ways in which India has handled this pandemic has been through its food distribution system, which is essentially a ration card system in which tens of millions of families are entitled, even in non-crisis times, to a basic sort of subsistence food basket. So this is something we urgently need to establish in Pakistan. It needs to be managed decentrally, in a decentralized sort of way, so that people know where to get the food to and how. Then I think critically we need to do something about low-income housing, and not in terms of what the Prime Minister's pie-in-the-sky ideas about Naya Pakistan housing. I think what we need to start off with is the most cost-effective, low-cost measures. We have 50% of our urban population that's living in informal settlements, and regularizing and upgrading those settlements is one of the quickest and easiest ways to give people a secure sort of housing safety net. And when we talk about the dangers of COVID spreading in slums, and it's already started doing that, well, that's because the reason that those places are dangerous is because we have the state has sort of systematically deprived those settlements, of those residents, of the protections that formality offers, which is basically access to basic services like water, like sanitation, like electricity, all of the things that you need, especially in a pandemic, in order to protect yourself. And then, of course, large-scale investments in public health, which if we don't get in this budget, then I don't think we're ever going to get in our lifetime. So that's one part of it. That's the social protection and the social safety side that we need to invest in now. We need to use this, as people are saying, this crisis as an opportunity. If you don't know it now, and I think there's a very good chance that the government is missing this opportunity entirely, as we already talked about, in terms of losing out on the opportunity to register and document the informal labor through the mobile banking sector that they haven't done so far. Just a second.
Just to add another question for you, Ammar, to what extent are you hopeful that the budget on the 12th of June might be able to address at least some of those concerns, or are you broadly pessimistic that it will not be able to do that?
I mean that's a complex question. I think the things that are going on right now do not give me much reason for optimism. I will say this much, that I have more expectations of the provincial budgets than I do of the federal one. To put it mildly, I think the provincial governments, I think to some extent, even those run by PTI, may be waking up to the magnitude of the crisis more than the federal government is, which seems to just want a bigger share of the resource pie without really investing in the sectors that matter. But at the same time, I think the other part of the picture, which we have to really work on, is the question of, and I think it's linked to the question you asked about exports as well. That obviously exports are extremely critical. We're not going to be able to develop as an economy without them. We're not going to be able to earn what we require to import without them. And I think those are linked to the Pakistan's stagnant exports are linked to the absence of a domestic productive sector, and specifically the absence, the long-standing lack of a robust manufacturing sector in the country. And I think this is something that has to be an element of the long-term recovery. We have to reverse the stagnation of manufacturing in a direction that is labor-intensive, in a direction that sort of draws capital away from the kind of speculative sort of investments, particularly in real estate, to some extent in the service sector, that we've seen over the past couple of decades, and towards more sort of labor-intensive and export-oriented and also ecologically sustainable sort of sectors. And I think the banking that we spoke about as well, I think what Maheen was talking about made a lot of sense, but I think that has a very big part to play in it. Our banking sector for the past couple of decades, like we said, has not invested in manufacturing at all. From 2005 to 2017, bank lending to the private sector, particularly to manufacturing, reduced from 35% of the lending portfolio to 16%. And as you said, the large part of the reason is that banks are primarily just earning money off the government, off government borrowing, and they have no incentive to do that. But I think it's also a question of a regulatory capacity and the fact that the state bank has not really done its job to force banks to lend for productive activity. And then I think it's also linked to that part where so much of our capital and so much of our savings has been getting funneled into non-productive, non-labor intensive real estate, where it's lying up there soaking up so much of capital saving, which is not really going into the lending pool. And it's not going into productive manufacturing activity. This is a dynamic that we have to break, and this has to be part of what we will need in terms of employment. The state will have to have a robust employment program, and the manufacturing sector will have to play a large part in that.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot there, Ammar. Dr. Malik, I wanted to bring this to you, and again, just maybe address a whole range of issues around recovery. But before you do, maybe I could just read off some of the questions that have come in as well, and you can see which of those you might want to tackle. Feridun Barkeshli has posted a question on YouTube asking, well, I think he's just commenting and saying that, the 63%, this is, I think, in response to what you said, Aamir. I'll let you handle that one when I come to you after Dr. Malik. Tamina Arshad has said that, has asked Dr. Pasha to expand on the PMLN government and the problems it faced while formalizing subsegments. It may be that that's a tongue-in-cheek question, or it may be a genuine one. I'll let you decide, Dr. Pasha. Mansoor Shakil has asked Maheen and Aamir on, to rate the federal government response. And Ali Shahid has asked about the health system getting choked. So there's a bunch of these questions. Samreen, you can take any of those if you want, but really, I wonder if you could address and maybe speak to Maheen's assessment of the recovery and whether you agree with that sectoral analysis, and then also some of the clear worries and fears that Ammar has. I hope you can offer some comfort and reassurance, because I think a lot of us are feeling quite nervous about what's to come down the line. Is the recovery going to be quicker than we think it is, or is it going to be worse than we think it is?
So I'm not somebody who can talk a lot about the political aspects of how things are happening in Pakistan. So I'm going to step aside on those questions and let others answer those. But in terms of recovery, I think we need to manage our expectation. The recovery is not going to be painless. It's going to be a painful recovery. It's going to be slow. And the good part that at least works in favor of Pakistan is that the two sectors where we actually export includes agriculture and pharmaceutical. In the short run, if we can fix our logistic issues, the supply chain issues, and we can still continue to send our products to the US, to China, and have some kind of a relief there, I think that would help us in the short run. However, in the long run, I don't think that this is the right policy which will help us in 2 years or 3 years. The problem is that many economies are basically reorienting their own economy. US is trying to bring all the production as close to themselves as possible. Trade models are all going to be about gravity or how close or the geographical proximity is going to be an important function of where the products bought from. So I think Pakistan will lose a big partner in terms of trade. But the good thing is we have China next door. In the short run, they're going through a negative growth rate, or probably in the last 30 years, they probably saw the first time a bad growth rate. So they will also take time to recover, but we can bank on that. We should be thinking forward. We should think what the future trade is going to look like. We need to change our partners. Everyone is reorienting, and Pakistan cannot be back on that race and then deciding after everyone has decided now what to do. So I think this is the time that we need to start taking those opportunities and actually making decisions of investing in companies, in firms that have products which are going to be helpful, not in 3 months, but in 5 months, in 1 year, 5 year, and 10-year period.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Malik. I think, very quickly, I just wanted Dr. Pasha to have a chance to answer that question. Dr. Pasha, you'll need to unmute your mic and just answer this question about the degree to which the PMLN government, or perhaps your government in the Punjab, was able to work on documentation. Yeah, you're good now. You're good now.
Yeah, I'm good. Wonderful. I'm glad you've asked about Punjab, and we have someone sitting here in the panel who can, help me and establish the case. About digitalization and making an effort for financial inclusion. In an effort, we launched, when we were in government, a scheme of interest-free loans to be dispersed through wallets, digital wallets, and Telenor actually helped us do it. And we were able to, through that mechanism, tap something like, I think, over 350,000 small farmers with land holdings of 5 acres to 12.5 acres or so. And also those were the farmers who actually were getting formal credit for the first time. 85 to 90% of those farmers were getting formal credit for the first time. So yes, we at the provincial level, we did do this. And Telenor head is sitting here. He would know about this initiative.
Madam,
the government of Punjab took
Madam,
as agriculture scheme.
You're going to have me put on the firing range, because we have the jazz head sitting with us, and of course, since the Telenor head is here, since the Telenor head is here, the biggest telecom.
My apologies. I meant Telenor. So anyway,
that's the point well made. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so this is the point. You know what, Musharraf, I would like to talk a little bit about the recovery part also, because see, we are at a stage where the budget is about to be announced. And I think this debate is very useful, because the government really should be given as many options to think about and deliberate, so that they can come up with a package which is effective, is credible, we know which can do it for us. And it's not like the last budget, where at the time of the announcement of the budget, we knew some of the targets were not to be met. met. The government under no circumstances will be able to meet them. The classic example being the revenue target of 5.5 trillion. So what is it that can be done? First of all, COVID has given us a good reason for us to sit back and talk to the IMF about the reality of economic situation in Pakistan. Even now, the IMF is talking about a tax recovery target of 5.1 trillion. They need to be told. And the government needs to tell them that, listen, when the economy isn't growing, that the growth rate for the next year of the economy is less than 1%. Inflation rate is less than, is going to be around 8% or so maximum. Some are saying less. Where is the tax revenue going to come from? If you burden the economy further, whatever little economic activity is taking place will go down even more. So we cannot let that happen. We need to just sit down with the IMF and talk to them about some of the targets. One. Secondly, in the budget, not only do we need to come up with a strong package of social protection, which will protect the incomes of the lowest strata of the population, but we need to give a little bit of boost to the SME sector, the agricultural sector, construction sector, particularly genuinely low-income housing is something which Ammar has also mentioned, and I'm a believer in it also, that a genuine construction activity boost can really motivate a lot it has a lot of forward and backward linkages and can motivate a lot of economic activity. That has to be done. Secondly, third, we need to ask the State Bank very clearly that this high policy rate is preempting government revenues that can otherwise be diverted to give relief and incentive for economic activity, and you're taking them away as debts for interest payments. Policy rate has to be adjusted. Over the last few months, the last year, almost $1 trillion extra has been spent on debt servicing, almost. Let me be conservative, 900 billion plus. That money could have very easily been diverted to social protection. And a lot of economic activity would have not been suffocated because of these high interest rates. So that has to be basically brought out. And this whole thing about curtailing inflation, we've been at this throughout the last...
Madam, yeah, I agree.
Government needs to give a boost to its development expenditure. Government has to cut the size of the government. Some of the non-essential expenditures has to cut. I think there is already some thinking on these lines, both at the federal as well as the provincial levels. They need to do this, divert money on the development side so that they can actually provide some incentive for the private sector also to take over. This is absolutely and totally important, along with giving a boost to the export sector. No new taxes which will be passed on to smaller businesses or to low income segments is very essential. We have already gone in high poverty rates. We need to be very clear as to where we are taking the economy. The question is it going to be an IMF-driven budget or a people's-driven budget where a little bit of economic activities and this whole argument that where do we have the finances? Well, you can find the finances if you lower the cost of debt servicing and you manage your current expenditure a little better, and perhaps a little bit of contribution from the upper segments of the population, the well-to-do ones. We can, sitting together, come up with extra funding which can support these economic activities. So I think you want me to stop, and I will stop now.
No, frankly, I would love you to continue, but we're at an hour and a half, and I wanted I wanted to bring, Aamir Ibrahim to kind of have the last word. And I wanted to bring two things to his attention in particular that he may be interested in addressing. One is this issue of, the sort of exuberant taxation. And one of the areas that, and this is not related to COVID, but one of the clear areas in which taxation had a negative impact on his sector was when sort of high-end mobile phones were taxed in a certain way. Maybe there's something he wants to say about that. Two additional comments that have come in, one from Inshan Ali Kanji that I wanted to bring in. I think he largely agrees with the analysis here. He says banks will not lend because of the largely informal and undocumented businesses. Banks do not have visibility into the cash flow of medium and small enterprises. Government should undertake reforms in the agricultural sector. And Varda Malik, who's our colleague here at Tabadlab, I believe, although it's possible that there are more than one, there is more than one Varda Malik. She says that there's opportunities in the crisis, but one of the key concerns she has is about pre-existing inequalities. Aamir, we always talk about, we being me and you, but many other people that believe in greater digitalization in society, we always talk about the importance of using digital to bridge the gaps and the inequalities in society. So, Aamir, you're going to have to unmute, but I hand it to you to close the conversation out.
Musharraf, if you let me indulge for a couple of minutes, because there were so many other interesting comments being made that I just want to talk about them, and then try to address those two pointed questions around taxation and documentation. But with all due respect to Dr. Aisha, and this is just a general thing, I think I've perhaps interacted with some of the smartest people who are not in the government on how things can actually improve. The sad reality is that when they actually do get the chance to do something, we end up perpetuating status quo rather than making those painful interventions that are needed. So I think the only relevant question right now is, where do we go from here? And I'm not a historian. I would rather make history rather than be a historian. And I think if that's the approach that many of our policymakers take, we would be better off. It doesn't really matter what PML did not do. We are where we are, and we need to get out of here. So I think we need to move forward. Number two, you did ask this thing about non-elites at a greater disadvantage. Let me give my 2 cents on that, or maybe 1 cent after devaluation. That is basically that internet is the greatest equalizer that we know of today. Tomorrow, the economic divide is going to be drawn on top of the digital divide. And the world is going to be divided in two categories: those who have access to internet and those who do not. So whatever we have talked about in the past, whether we have opportunities or not, tomorrow those opportunities of education, commerce, engagement, enlightenment, they will all come if somebody has internet and access to internet or not. And that is where I think we need to make a much faster inroad into. And then Maheen, I think you asked, I think perhaps a challenging or maybe an interesting question that, like banks, perhaps is one of the easiest sectors to make money. I wish that was also the case for telecoms, where 2 out of the 4 companies don't make money, yet I see about 35 banks in Pakistan who still make money, and yet the penetration in that particular segment is 20%, whereas in telecom it is 80%. So I don't know whether we have the right balance from a policy intervention perspective and setting the right level of ambitions for certain sectors to be able to not only make money, there's nothing wrong with making money, but to be able to contribute. If after 70 years we have a total of 55,000 electronic points of service available, or 14,000 ATM machines, and like 80% of adults not having banking, can we actually call banking a successful sector? So those are the kind of challenging ambitions that we need to set ourselves, not as a banking sector, but as policymakers, right? How do we move the country forward? How can we keep on talking about documentation. We've done absolutely nothing in forcing documentation. Now, wasn't a rant, but just some comments which I thought were really interesting. I wanted to make. Things,
that little bit especially, so thank you for that.
Okay. Now, 2 things. Perhaps they are in a way related to some of the things where we can actually make progress. Taxation. There are 2 components to internet usage. Actually, perhaps more. Access, availability. Access is, unless you are in a 4G area, there wouldn't be anything. Then the affordability becomes important. Affordability is in 2 aspects. How expensive is it to use the internet services, and Pakistan is amongst the countries which have the cheapest rates in the world. But the entry barrier is not the daily or the monthly rates. The entry barrier is the handset. And today in Pakistan, we still consider this a luxury item. We tax it like a luxury item. This is basically your most essential productivity tool. And unless the government changes its mindset that this is actually a replacement for a computer, not necessarily a rich man's toy, we will still be stuck where we've been stuck. So unless we bring in greater production, local production of affordable 4G handsets, tablets, devices, we are going to be where we were. And we have to change this mindset that anybody who uses a smartphone is a rich man or a woman and we should tax them heavily. That mindset has to change. It is the basic remote control to your life. And by not allowing the poorer or the less affluent members of our society to have this remote control, we are only accentuating the divide between the have and the have-nots. Ali asked this question about documentation. Again, let's work together. There is a lot of data available. So we do advanced analytics. So from there, we can do credit scoring. We don't necessarily have to have all those credit scoring bureaus. But I think it all comes down to intent. And that's where I go back to my starting point that I think in this crisis, we have learned a number of things. And it's easy, perhaps easier than ever before, to find fault in any kind of a policy or decision. Whether it is Pakistan, I think you asked this question to somebody, have we been slightly more critical to our government and our leaders? I think literally every government has had the same kind of reaction from its populace. No strategy has really stood the test of time, whether it was Sweden or anywhere else. So maybe we are being more critical. But I come back to one thing. We are where we are. We need to move forward. And we have the opportunity of either becoming historians or create history.
That's a fantastic little bow to put on the conversation, Aamir. As usual, you live up to the self-proclaimed but quite rightfully owned label of being an optimist. I think it is a huge opportunity. I think that there's legitimate worry about how bad things could get over the next few weeks and months. But I think at that time, if and when they do, and I think a lot of us fear that they will, it'll be our optimism, constructive, realistic optimism that will help us dig through the ditch that perhaps we are driving into or being driven into. I want to thank, obviously, the entire group that joined us for this roundtable. Dr. Aisha Ghaus Pasha, who was not shy of answering some pointed questions. Dr. Samreen Malik, I thought you spoke extremely well. I'm really grateful that you made the time. Maheen Rahman, you spoke, as always, as fluidly and fluently as you always do. Thank you for making the time to be with us. Ammar, you opened the conversation for us. Thank you for that paper. We'll be putting that paper as well as links to other papers and documents around the economic impact of COVID on the website where this episode will be published as well. And Aamir, as always, thoughtful, constructive, obviously partisan in the sense of digitalization being your baby. But I think it needs to become the baby of the entire country. At the end, I would like to once again thank the Canadian High Commission and also my colleagues Ovais Jafar and Shahab Siddiqui, who are sitting behind these screens trying to make things work in a reasonably fluid way. This was our first effort at doing this live, and I thought it went really well. Everybody's connectivity was decent. I think that screen looks fantastic, and it looks fantastic because of all of you. Final and most of all, thanks to those that joined us live and those that posted questions on YouTube and Facebook. Keep coming back and joining us for these conversations. We're trying hard to shift the burden of policy from screaming and ranting without data to constructing and organizing conversations around evidence, data, and actual expertise, as some of the panelists here manifest. Thanks once again, and goodbye. Take care. Khuda Hafiz.